Some promises are not made for love, but for survival. That was the sentence Sean Carter would remember years later when people asked him how his marriage to Henry Whitmore began. At the time, however, it had felt less like the beginning of a story and more like the closing of a door. Sean had grown up knowing one simple truth. In his parents' eyes, he was not a son. He was an asset. A quiet Omega born into a struggling family. He had spent most of his childhood overhearing hushed conversations about wealthy alphas, contracts, and opportunities that always seemed to involve his future. The older he grew, the more obvious their intentions became. Every visit from a well-dressed stranger made Sean uneasy. Every polite introduction felt like an inspection. He learned quickly to stay quiet, to keep his head down, and to avoid attracting attention. The only person who ever stood between Sean and that fate was his grandfather. The old man had a calm voice, steady hands, and a stubborn sense of loyalty that refused to bend even when the rest of the family pushed back. While others saw Sean as a bargaining chip, his grandfather saw a frightened boy who simply wanted a normal life. And for years, he protected him the only way he could, by keeping him close and refusing every offer that came through the door. But time has a way of forcing difficult decisions. When his grandfather's health began to fail, he knew he wouldn't always be there to shield Sean from the world. That was when he reached out to the one person he trusted more than anyone else. An old friend who had once stood beside him through decades of life, business, and hardship. The Whitmore family was powerful, respected, and far removed from the desperate bargains Sean's parents tried to arrange. Their name carried weight in every major city on the East Coast. And at the center of that family stood Henry Whitmore, the heir to the entire legacy. Tall, controlled, and known in every major boardroom from New York to Chicago, Henry had built a reputation for being sharp, disciplined, and almost impossible to manipulate. To Sean, however, Henry was simply a stranger he had never met. The arrangement between the two grandfathers was simple in theory, but life-changing in reality. To guarantee Sean's safety and remove him from his parents' control, the two elders agreed on something permanent. A marriage. Sean would become Henry Whitmore's husband, protected by the Whitmore name and beyond the reach of anyone who wished to trade him for money. On paper, it was the perfect solution. In reality, there was one problem neither grandfather could fully solve. Henry Whitmore hated Omegas. Not casually, not quietly. It was a belief shaped by years of pressure, politics, and carefully orchestrated attempts to force him into alliances he never wanted. In his world, Omegas were often used as tools to trap powerful alphas into obligations they could not escape. Because of those experiences, Henry trusted contracts more than instincts and distance more than affection. So when the day came that Sean Carter arrived at the Whitmore estate with a single suitcase and a letter written in his grandfather's careful handwriting, neither of them believed this marriage would become anything more than a promise made to honor the past. Henry Whitmore did not look at Sean Carter when they met for the first time. The Whitmore estate stood just outside Boston, surrounded by tall oak trees and long gravel drives that stretched across several quiet acres. The house itself was the kind people only saw in magazines, a modern stone mansion with tall glass windows and perfectly trimmed lawns that rolled down toward a private lake. To Sean, it felt less like a home and more like a place where every step echoed louder than it should. He stood in the wide entry hall with his small suitcase resting beside his leg while the late afternoon sunlight spilled through the windows and painted pale patterns across the marble floor. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock ticked slowly. It was the only sound until footsteps approached from the far end of the hall. Henry Whitmore walked in without hurry, dressed in a dark suit as if he had just stepped out of a boardroom meeting. He was taller than Sean expected, with calm gray eyes and a posture that suggested a lifetime of control and discipline. When his gaze finally settled on Sean, it was not angry or cold. It was distant, as if he were studying a situation rather than meeting a person. For a few quiet seconds neither of them spoke. Then Henry reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a folded document on the marble table near the door. His voice was even and professional, the same tone someone might use when explaining a contract during a business meeting. He said that the marriage arranged by their grandfathers would be honored because a promise had been made, but there would be conditions. They would live under the same roof, but their lives would remain separate. Sean would have full access to the estate, his own room, and anything he needed to live comfortably. In return, he would not interfere with Henry's work or personal decisions. Henry also explained that after 1 year the marriage would end legally and quietly, and both of them would be free to move on with their lives. There would be no expectations beyond maintaining the appearance of a respectful household. Sean listened carefully, his hands folded in front of him as he absorbed every word. Nothing in Henry's voice sounded cruel, but the distance in his tone made it clear that this arrangement meant duty rather than affection. When Henry finished speaking, the hall fell silent again. Sean lowered his eyes briefly and nodded. He said that he understood and that he had no intention of causing trouble for anyone. That simple answer seemed to catch Henry slightly off guard. For a moment Henry studied him more closely, perhaps expecting an argument or some attempt to negotiate. Instead, Sean only lifted his suitcase and quietly asked where he should put his things. A staff member appeared to guide him upstairs, and the sound of their footsteps faded along the wide staircase. Henry remained standing in the entry hall long after Sean disappeared from view. He told himself that nothing about this arrangement would change his life. It was simply a promise made to two old men who had trusted each other for decades. In 12 months, the contract would end, and the quiet stranger who had just entered his house would walk away as if none of it had ever mattered. The first weeks of living at the Whitmore estate passed with a quiet rhythm that Sean quickly learned not to disturb. The house itself was enormous. Nearly 20,000 square feet of polished stone floors, glass walls, and long hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly toward rooms Sean never entered. Every morning sunlight rolled across the lake behind the estate and filled the kitchen with pale golden light, but Henry was rarely there to see it. Most days he left before 7 in the morning, his schedule filled with meetings in downtown Boston or flights to other cities where the Whitmore family business demanded his attention. Sean, meanwhile, settled into a routine so gentle it almost felt like he was trying to make himself invisible. He woke early, often before the household staff had finished preparing breakfast, and spent his mornings reading in the sunroom that overlooked the water. Sometimes he helped the kitchen staff prepare tea or organize small errands around the estate, not because anyone asked him to, but because he did not want to feel like a guest who only occupied space. Henry noticed these details even though they rarely spoke. At first he assumed Sean was carefully performing the role of a quiet and agreeable Omega, the same strategy Henry had seen others use in the past when they wanted to gain trust. But weeks passed, and Sean never asked for anything. He did not attempt to join Henry at business dinners. He did not follow him around the house. He did not try to influence him with soft words or carefully chosen gestures. In fact, many evenings Henry would return home after 10 o'clock at night and realize he had not seen Sean even once that entire day. The distance was exactly what Henry had demanded when the arrangement began, yet something about Sean's behavior slowly unsettled him. One evening in early autumn, Henry walked through the main living room after a long day of meetings and noticed a faint scent of fresh tea drifting from the open doors of the back patio. Outside, Sean sat alone at a small table near the lake with a book resting in his lap. The breeze moved gently across the water, lifting a few strands of Sean's dark hair as he read quietly under the fading orange sky. Henry paused inside the doorway for a moment without announcing himself. What caught his attention was not the peaceful scene itself, but the subtle tension in Sean's posture. Even from several feet away, Henry could tell that Sean was breathing slowly and carefully, as if he were concentrating on maintaining control over something uncomfortable. Henry understood what it was immediately. An Omega living in the same house as an Alpha could easily be affected by scent and instinct, especially in a quiet environment where those signals had nowhere to disperse. Most Omegas would have approached him by now, asking for distance, reassurance, or assistance during moments when their instincts became difficult to manage. Sean had done none of that. Instead, he simply remained where he was, turning another page of his book and pretending that nothing was wrong. Henry stepped outside then, the gravel shifting quietly beneath his shoes. Sean looked up at once, startled but polite, closing the book in his hands. For a brief moment their eyes met across the small patio table, and Henry noticed the same calm expression Sean always carried, steady and careful. It was the expression of someone who had spent a lifetime learning how not to ask for help. Henry did not immediately answer Sean when their eyes met across the patio table. The evening breeze moved quietly across the surface of the lake, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves and cool water through the open space between them. For a few seconds, he simply studied the Omega sitting across from him. Sean looked calm, composed, and polite as always, yet Henry could still sense the tension hidden beneath that stillness. It was subtle, the kind of discomfort most people would miss entirely, but Henry had spent his entire life learning to read the smallest details in a room. He knew when someone was nervous, when someone was lying, and when someone was trying too hard to appear unaffected. Sean Carter, he realized, had been quietly enduring the same thing for weeks. Henry finally stepped closer and rested one hand on the back of the empty chair across the table. He asked Sean if the house had everything he needed, whether the staff had treated him well, and whether the estate felt comfortable enough to live in for the remainder of the year. The questions sounded formal, almost distant, yet Sean answered them sincerely. He said the staff had been kind, and that the house was far more than he had ever expected. His voice remained steady, though he kept his hands folded around the warm ceramic cup in front of him as if grounding himself in the moment. Henry noticed that detail as well. Most people would have taken the opportunity to ask for something. A different room. Access to the city. Some request that would slowly blur the boundaries Henry had set. Sean did none of that. Instead, he simply thanked Henry for allowing him to stay and assured him that he intended to keep his promise not to interfere with anything in Henry's life. That response lingered in Henry's mind long after the conversation ended. In the days that followed, he began noticing Sean more often, not intentionally, but in the quiet ways people observe the routines of someone who shares their home. Sean spent hours in the sunroom reading or writing letters that he never seemed to send. Occasionally, he walked along the narrow stone path that curved around the lake behind the estate, always stopping near the same wooden bench overlooking the water. Sometimes he spoke with the staff in the kitchen, asking gentle questions about recipes or helping carry small trays back to the dining room when the household grew busy. None of these actions seemed calculated or strategic. They were simply the habits of someone trying to live peacefully in a place that was not truly his. Henry found himself remembering the conversation from their first meeting, the calm way Sean had accepted the one-year arrangement without protest. The reaction still felt unusual. In Henry's experience, people rarely agreed so easily to terms that gave them so little power. Yet Sean had done exactly that. One evening several weeks later, Henry returned home earlier than usual after canceling a late meeting in the city. As he stepped into the quiet foyer, he heard the soft sound of piano music drifting from the far end of the house. The melody was gentle and slow, the kind of music someone might play simply to pass time rather than perform for an audience. Curious, Henry followed the sound through the hallway until he reached the small music room near the east wing. The door stood partially open. Inside, Sean sat at the piano bench with his back to the doorway, carefully pressing each key as if he were rediscovering the instrument after years away. The notes filled the room with a quiet warmth that did not match the tense expectations Henry had once associated with Omegas. Standing there in the doorway, Henry realized something that unsettled him more than he expected. Sean Carter was not behaving like someone trying to trap an alpha into obligation. He was behaving like someone who had finally found a place where he could breathe. Late October arrived with colder air drifting across the Whitmore estate, and the calm routine that had quietly formed over the past weeks began to change in ways neither Henry nor Sean had expected. The trees surrounding the lake turned deep shades of red and gold, and the long walking path behind the house became covered in dry leaves that crunched softly underfoot. Sean still followed his usual habits each morning, but Henry had begun noticing subtle differences. Sean seemed more tired than before, sometimes pausing along the path to catch his breath or sitting longer than usual in the sunroom with a blanket folded around his shoulders. He never complained, never asked for assistance, and never mentioned anything unusual. But Henry noticed the small signs, the quiet pauses, the careful breathing, the way Sean sometimes held the edge of a table for balance before continuing with whatever he had been doing. One evening Henry returned from Boston earlier than expected after finishing a meeting ahead of schedule. The sky had already turned dark blue, and a steady wind had begun to sweep across the lake. As he stepped out of the car near the front entrance, he saw one of the estate staff approaching quickly with a worried expression. The staff member explained that Sean had gone for his usual walk along the lake path nearly an hour earlier and had not yet returned. Normally the walk took less than 30 minutes. The path itself was safe, but the woods surrounding the property stretched for several miles, and the evening temperature had already dropped into the low 50s. Henry did not hesitate. He grabbed a flashlight from the entry table and headed down the stone path that curved toward the lake. The wind had grown stronger, scattering dry leaves across the ground and rustling through the tall trees that lined the water. After several minutes of walking, he finally spotted a faint figure sitting on the wooden bench near the far edge of the path. Sean was there, leaning forward slightly with his hands pressed against the bench beside him as if steadying himself. When Henry approached, he could immediately sense the tension in the air around Sean. It was not fear or panic. It was something instinctive and difficult to control, the natural cycle that every Omega eventually faced, whether they wanted to or not. Sean lifted his head when he heard Henry's footsteps and looked startled to see him there. He tried to stand quickly, clearly embarrassed to have been found in such a vulnerable moment, but his balance faltered slightly. Henry reached out instinctively and steadied him by the arm. Sean immediately apologized and insisted that he only needed a few minutes before he could return to the house on his own. But the quiet strain in his voice told Henry everything he needed to know. The evening air had grown colder, and Sean's hands were trembling slightly despite his effort to remain composed. Henry had spent years believing that Omegas used vulnerability as a form of manipulation. Yet standing there beside the lake, watching Sean struggle to maintain his dignity even while clearly uncomfortable, Henry realized something that challenged that belief in a way he could not easily dismiss. Sean was not asking for help. He was trying very hard not to need it at all. Without another word, Henry removed his coat and draped it over Sean's shoulders before guiding him slowly back along the path toward the warm lights of the house. The walk back to the house was slow but steady, the gravel path crunching softly beneath their shoes as the lights of the Whitmore estate grew brighter in the distance. Henry kept his pace measured so Sean would not feel rushed, though he could still sense the effort Sean was making to remain composed. The coat around Sean's shoulders hung loosely, carrying the faint warmth of Henry's scent, and for the first time since arriving at the estate Sean did not try to step away from it. The wind had calmed slightly by the time they reached the back entrance, and the warm air inside the house felt like a quiet shelter from the cold evening outside. One of the staff members approached immediately, concern visible on her face, but Henry gave a small nod that reassured her everything was under control. Sean quietly thanked her before excusing himself and heading toward the guest wing where his room was located. Henry watched him go, noticing the careful way Sean kept his posture straight even though the exhaustion in his movements was obvious. A few minutes later, Henry followed down the same hallway and stopped outside Sean's door. For a moment he simply stood there, uncertain whether his presence would make the situation easier or more uncomfortable. Finally he knocked once, a quiet sound against the wooden frame. Sean opened the door after a short pause. The room behind him was dimly lit by a single lamp near the bed, and the soft glow revealed how pale his face had become. Even so, Sean offered the same polite expression he always carried, as if determined to reassure Henry that nothing was wrong. Henry asked if he needed anything. Sean shook his head gently and said he only needed time to rest. His voice remained calm, though the effort it took to maintain that calm was clear. Henry studied him for a moment before stepping inside the room and closing the door behind him. He explained that the house was quiet tonight and that no one would disturb them, then moved to the nearby chair and sat down as if settling into a long conversation rather than a brief visit. Sean looked surprised but did not argue. The minutes passed slowly, the quiet room filled only with the faint sound of wind brushing against the windows outside. Occasionally Sean shifted slightly on the edge of the bed, trying to maintain his composure without drawing attention to the discomfort he was experiencing. Henry remained where he was, calm and patient, offering no pressure and asking no questions that would force Sean to explain himself. At some point the tension in the room began to ease. The steady presence beside him seemed to give Sean enough reassurance to finally relax his guarded posture. Hours passed like that, the quiet of the night wrapping around the estate while the lights in Sean's room remained on. When the first pale hint of dawn appeared through the window, Sean was resting peacefully against the pillows, his breathing slow and even. Henry had not moved from the chair beside the bed. Watching the early morning light touch the walls of the room, he realized something that unsettled and comforted him at the same time. For years he had believed that Omegas used instinct to control alphas. Yet the person sleeping quietly a few feet away had spent the entire night trying not to inconvenience anyone at all. Morning arrived slowly over the Whitmore estate, pale sunlight stretching across the lake and filtering through the tall windows of the house. The quiet stillness of early dawn had already passed when Sean finally woke. For a moment he remained still, staring at the ceiling as if trying to remember where he was. Then his eyes moved toward the chair beside the bed. Henry Whitmore was still there. He sat exactly where he had been hours earlier, one arm resting lightly on the chair, while the soft light from the window illuminated the calm expression on his face. Sean blinked in surprise, pushing himself up slightly against the pillows. The movement caught Henry's attention and he looked over immediately. Their eyes met for a brief moment before Sean lowered his gaze, clearly unsure what to say. The room felt different now, quieter and warmer than the night before. Henry stood slowly and asked how Sean was feeling. His voice was steady, though there was a gentleness in it that had not been there during their first conversations weeks ago. Sean answered that he was fine and apologized for causing trouble the previous evening. The apology came automatically, as if it were a habit he had learned long ago. Henry did not respond to the apology directly. Instead, he walked toward the window and pulled the curtain aside slightly, letting more sunlight fill the room. Outside, the lake reflected the pale gold of the morning sky, while the trees surrounding the estate swayed softly in the cool breeze. After a moment, he turned back and told Sean that breakfast would be ready soon if he felt strong enough to come downstairs. Sean nodded quietly, though he remained seated on the edge of the bed for a while after Henry left the room. The rest of the day unfolded with a subtle change in the atmosphere of the house. Henry's schedule had originally included several meetings in Boston, yet by mid-morning, he had canceled them all. Instead, he remained at the estate, working from his office while occasionally stepping into the hallway, as if checking on something he did not want to name. Sean noticed the difference, but did not mention it. He spent most of the afternoon in the sunroom with a cup of tea resting beside the open book in his lap, though he found himself reading the same page more than once without fully focusing on the words. The quiet understanding that had formed during the long night lingered between them even, though they spoke very little about it. Late that evening, Henry received a visit from Daniel Carter, an old friend who often stopped by the estate after business trips through the city. The two men sat in the study discussing contracts and investment plans while the soft glow of the fireplace warmed the room. Their conversation eventually drifted away from work toward more personal topics. At one point, Daniel asked how Henry was managing the unusual arrangement created by their grandfathers. Henry leaned back slightly in his chair and answered with the same thoughtful tone he used in boardroom discussions. He explained that his opinion about omegas had not changed simply because of a promise made years ago. In his experience, instincts and pheromones often complicated clear decisions, and he preferred to keep his distance from situations that relied on those things. The words were calm and matter-of-fact, not meant to insult anyone in particular. Yet outside the half-open study door, Sean had just paused while carrying a small tray of tea for the staff. He heard enough of the conversation to understand the meaning behind Henry's words. The tray remained steady in his hands, but the quiet warmth that had grown inside his chest since the night before slowly faded into a familiar feeling of distance. Sean did not enter the study after hearing Henry's words. Instead, he turned quietly and continued down the hallway, the small tray still balanced carefully in his hands as if nothing unusual had happened. The soft glow from the lamps along the corridor cast long shadows across the polished floor, and each step he took felt steady even though his thoughts had begun to shift in a direction he had hoped to avoid. For weeks, he had believed something inside their quiet arrangement was beginning to change. The long night Henry had spent beside his bed had felt like proof that perhaps Henry no longer saw him as a burden or an obligation. Yet hearing the calm certainty in Henry's voice only moments earlier reminded Sean that some beliefs were not easily replaced. Henry had not sounded angry or cruel. He had simply sounded certain. Sean placed the tray on the kitchen counter and excused himself from the staff before returning to his room in the guest wing. The house was quiet by the time he closed the door behind him. Outside the tall window, the lake reflected the dim silver light of the moon, and the cool night air brushed softly against the glass. Sean sat on the edge of the bed and allowed the silence to settle around him. The truth was simple enough to understand. Henry had never wanted this marriage. The agreement had been made by two men who believed they were protecting him, and Henry had accepted it only out of respect for their promise. The one-year arrangement had always been clear from the beginning. Sean had known that when he arrived with his suitcase and the letter from his grandfather. Yet somewhere during the quiet days that followed, he had begun to forget that this house was never meant to be his home forever. The realization did not make him angry. Instead, it filled him with a quiet determination. If Henry truly wished to keep his distance from omegas and from the instincts that complicated his life, then Sean had no intention of forcing him into something he did not want. The next morning, Sean scheduled a routine appointment at a small medical clinic in the nearby town. He had not been feeling entirely well for several days, and the nurse who greeted him suggested a simple test to rule out anything unusual. Sean waited patiently in the examination room while soft music played from a speaker in the corner. The minutes passed slowly until the doctor returned with a thoughtful expression and a folder in his hands. The news he shared was gentle but impossible to misunderstand. Sean was pregnant. For a long moment, Sean simply sat there, absorbing the words as they settled into his thoughts. The quiet night Henry had spent beside him weeks earlier returned to his memory with sudden clarity. Nothing about that night had felt planned or intentional. It had simply been a moment when instinct and circumstance had drawn them closer than either of them had expected. Sean thanked the doctor calmly and stepped outside into the cool morning air. The small town street was peaceful, with cars moving slowly past the row of brick storefronts. He rested one hand lightly against his stomach as he stood there, realizing that the future he had just decided to release was suddenly far more complicated than he had imagined. Sean did not return to the Whitmore estate immediately after leaving the clinic. Instead, he walked slowly along the quiet sidewalk of the small town, the crisp morning air brushing gently across his face as he tried to steady his thoughts. Cars passed occasionally along the street, and somewhere nearby a cafe door opened as the scent of fresh coffee drifted into the cool autumn air. Everything around him continued as usual, yet the world inside his mind had shifted in a way he could not ignore. The life growing quietly inside him changed everything about the decision he had made the night before. Sean had planned to ask Henry for a divorce so both of them could return to the separate lives they had expected from the beginning. Now that future was no longer so simple. By the time he returned to the estate, the afternoon sun had begun to sink behind the tall trees surrounding the lake. The house looked the same as always, calm and distant, its tall windows reflecting the golden light of early evening. Sean stepped inside quietly, placing his coat on the rack near the entrance before walking down the long hallway toward the study. Henry was there exactly where Sean expected him to be, seated behind the large desk with several documents spread neatly across the polished surface. When Sean entered, Henry looked up immediately, noticing the unusual seriousness in Sean's expression. Sean spoke first. His voice remained calm, though the words required careful effort to say aloud. He explained that he had been thinking about their arrangement and believed it would be best if they ended the marriage sooner than planned. The request hung in the quiet room between them. Henry did not respond right away. Instead, he studied Sean closely, sensing that the situation carried more weight than a simple change of plans. Sean continued before Henry could speak again. He told Henry about the appointment at the clinic and about the news the doctor had shared that morning. The room fell completely silent after the words were spoken. For several long seconds, Henry did not move. The information forced him to confront something he had never fully examined before. All his life, he had believed that omegas used instinct to trap alphas into obligations they never chose. Yet the person standing in front of him had never once tried to control him or take advantage of their situation. Sean had kept his distance from the beginning, honoring every boundary Henry had set. Even now, after discovering something that tied their lives together far more deeply than a contract ever could, Sean's first instinct had been to offer Henry his freedom. Henry slowly stood from the chair behind the desk and walked toward the window overlooking the lake. The fading sunlight stretched across the water, turning the surface into a wide mirror of orange and gold. For years, he had protected himself from situations that relied on instinct or emotion. But standing there in the quiet study, he realized that what he truly feared had never been omegas themselves. What he feared was losing control over his own life. When Henry finally turned back toward Sean, his voice carried a quiet certainty that had not been there before. He said that the marriage arranged by their grandfathers might have begun as a promise between two old friends, but the future in front of them no longer belonged to the past. If Sean was willing to stay, then Henry wanted to build something real rather than walk away from it. Not because of obligation or tradition, but because the small family they had unknowingly created deserved a place where it could grow in peace.